How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 16th video on the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the 4th chapter of Bruce Fink's book, The Lacanian Subject, titled rather fittingly, also The Lacanian Subject. Last time, we looked at what Lacan means when he talks about the real order, and the division between it and reality. In this episode, we'll begin our investigation into the central idea of this book, what exactly the subject is to Lacan. This chapter is split into too many sections to summarize, so I'm just going to state them as we go along. Fink begins by discussing structuralism and its view of a subject. Essentially, he says, subjectivity was seen to be necessarily at odds with structure, with the one idea undermining the other. It's here that Lacan's break from standard structuralism is most clear. Despite his use of structure, he also maintains and defends the concept of a subject. However, his understanding of what it means to be a subject is radically different to many of the characteristics that Western philosophy attaches to it. Fink's purpose with this chapter is to show just that, to examine what makes the Lacanian subject unique. He expressly doesn't seek to prove to us its existence, however, since, as Lacan says,
the subject is never more than supposed.
Despite this fact, Lacan held that the notion of a subject is a necessary construct when it comes to the psychoanalytic experience. Fink therefore aims to lend credence to the idea, examining first what it isn't. This takes us to the first subchapter, lengthily titled The Lacanian Subject is not the individual, or conscious subject of Anglo-American philosophy. The first division that needs to be made is between how different languages talk about their analysans. For example, an English-speaking psychologist might call them a client, a patient, or an individual. However, in French, they are likely to be referred to as a subject. We need to get this out of the way now to try and limit any confusion. The Lacanian subject is not, it must be emphasized, part and parcel with the analysan referred to as a subject. The Lacanian subject also isn't the same as the thinking subject. In Fink's words,
the Lacanian subject is neither the individual nor what we might call the conscious subject or the consciously thinking subject, the subject referred to by most of analytic philosophy.
This type of subject is essentially identical to what in psychoanalysis is called the ego, essentially the psychoanalytic self. In Lacan's work, he conceptualizes the ego as developing through the crystallization of ideal images in the mind of the child. For example, their reflection in a mirror, which seems perfect just like their parents, in contrast to the uncoordinated mess they find in themselves. These images are invested into the child's mind through the interference of their parents or others around them, who point out their reflection in the mirror by saying, that's, well, them. Different ideal images are internalized too, like the notion of being a bad child or a model student, the parental big other reflecting those onto them, the images thus being symbolically structured. Once these images are internalized by the child, they begin to fuse together to reveal something of a unified self. This self, however, is always changing, as other identifications occur and new images flow in whilst old ones flow out. This ego, this self-image, is not an active thing in Lacan. Rather, it's the seat of narcissistic attachment and fixation. He ends the chapter by referring to the ego as a subject of a statement, essentially the word I we begin and imply in sentences, something far removed from the true Lacanian subject. It's this idea that he focuses on in the next section, which is titled The Lacanian Subject is not the subject of the statement. Attempting to find it, he looked towards linguistics, particularly towards work dealing with the subject of sentences. In particular, he became interested in the work on so-called shifters of Roman Jakobson. In his seminal essay on them, Jakobson develops the concept of code, which he says contains a set of signifiers used in speaking and writing. This is what Lacan often refers to as the treasury or battery of signifiers. This is put in conjunction with the notion of message, what the speaker in fact says. He joins and cuts up these two categories in 4 different ways. Firstly, there are messages referring to other messages, for example quotations, where a previous message is included inside a current one. Next, there are your messages that refer to code. Take as an example the word puppy, designating a young dog. It provides meaning to an element of the code. In other words, they are definitions. Thirdly, we find elements of the code that refer to the code itself. Jacobson's example is of proper names. In Fink's words,
Jerry refers to a person named Jerry. That name designates whoever it is that bears or is called by that name.
Finally, but not at all leastly, there are elements of a code that are connected to messages. For example, personal pronouns like I, you, and she. Their meaning can only be ascertained by reference to the message, to what their role in it is. These are what Jacobson terms as shifters, since they designate change in each new message that isn't seen with Jacobson's other, relatively stable categories. It's thus that the grammatical subject of a sentence is a shifter, the idea of an I that makes up the ego, for example. When the subject of a statement opens their mouth or sets their pen to paper, they identify themselves with a certain ideal image, such as one based on being kind instead of miserly, or open-minded rather than bigoted. This takes us to the next subchapter, titled The Lacanian Subject Appears Nowhere in What Is Said. In the early 60s, Lacan began turning towards the French word ne, one half of the negation ne pas. When it's used alone, it doesn't fully negate things, with the exception of a few verbs like pouvoir. Instead, it implies something subtler, what is sometimes referred to as introducing discordance. Essentially, it adds a certain quality of uncertainty, ambiguity, and hesitance. To quote Fink,
It appears as if to suggest that the speaker is denying the very thing he is asserting, afraid of the very thing he claims to wish, or wishing for the same thing he seems to fear.
all in all, we get the impression that the speaker both wants and doesn't want what is being discussed. In English, a similar effect can be produced with the word but. The sentence, I can't help but think that, can be translated as, I can't stop myself from thinking that. The word but has multiple different connotations, like only, simply, or just. Yet sometimes it goes even further than that, such as in the case of acting almost like a form of negation, something that trips up even native speakers. For example, take the phrases, I can't but imagine he won't call, and I can't but not suspect him of having done it. After all, he is my best friend. How can we tell the difference between wanting him to call or not wanting to, suspecting him and not suspecting him? A conflict seems to appear here, made possible by the ambiguity afforded by English grammar in the case of but, and French grammar in the case of ne. This conflict seems to be played out between the subject of the ego and something else, something that takes advantage of its grammatical looseness. This other agency, this unconscious discourse, seems almost to interrupt the conscious one, yelling no. As Fink says,
We can take the French ne as signifying the speaking or enunciating subject, y as signifying. But here is not the name of the subject of enunciation, rather it points to a sort of no saying.
This word, ne in French, but in English, is a part of the code. It additionally acts similar to a shifter. Insofar as it appears in the message, it tells us something about the speaker, that they're ambivalent, saying both yes and no at the same time, saying one thing but implying another. In a word, they aren't fully in agreement with what they're saying. But can't be a shifter, since, by their definition, shifters are the grammatical subjects of the statement. Instead, it acts sort of like a naysaying that occurs during enunciation, as Fink pointed out earlier. It can be seen as breaking down the statement into two parts, represented by this diagram. In Lacan's eyes, the concepts of code and message don't suffice here. Instead, we have to look at the interference between enunciation and what is being enunciated. In other words, between what is stated, content, and the physical act of stating. He concludes the section by saying that this ambivalent nature of but shows that there's a split in the subject, a split between what is conscious and what isn't. We now arrive at the next subchapter, the fleetingness of the subject. Fink begins by underlining a very specific point. This other subject, the one represented through but, is in some sort of substratum or hidden substance. Instead, it only appears when specific conditions present themselves. Whilst the unconscious is a permanent chain endlessly being played out, as we've gone over in earlier videos, that isn't to say that the subject itself is permanent. It's a mistake to confuse the two. In Fink's words,
Lacan states that a signifier marks the cancellation of what it signifies. N and but sign the death sentence of the subject of the unconscious.
What this means is that the subject only exists long enough to object, to yell no. As soon as that is complete, it becomes just another signifier. In other words, it's usurped. To demonstrate what he means, Fink offers this diagram. The barred S refers to the split nature of a subject, which is alienated by the other. S1, on the other hand, refers here to no or but as a first signifier. The subject disappears behind this S1, that signifier becoming a stand-in for it. To borrow Fink's words once again,
the subject of the unconscious manifests itself in daily life as a fleeting interruption of something foreign. The subject appears only as a pulsation that immediately dies away.
This takes us to a rather short section called the Freudian Subject. All Fink does here is to connect this idea of a subject as a breach of some kind to Freud in particular. Although Lacan saw himself as setting out a return to Freud, they did have some diverging views. In this case, Freud viewed the unconscious as having some sort of agency, something dismissed by Lacan, who viewed it solely as the discourse of the big other. Thus, to sign the subject as being part and parcel of the unconscious is a Freudian move, rather than a Lacanian one. With this little aside out of the way, Fink returns to examining what isn't the Lacanian subject. This section is titled The Cartesian Subject and its Inverse, and deals with just that. Something interesting about the Freudian subject is that it seems to have no temporal permanence. It's like a flash in the pan, there only for a brief moment. In Lacan's eyes, this is very similar to Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am. The Cartesian subject is only able to ascertain its own existence by repeating the cogito, the only way it can convince itself of its being. As soon as it stops repeating them, that subject immediately loses all conviction. The Cartesian subject can therefore be schematized like this. It only exists when thinking and being co-occur, for example, when repeating the cogito. In Lacan's view, this is overly utopian. Instead of being able to find refuge between the two, the Lacanian subject can only choose one, represented as so. With this, Lacan inverts the cogito, hence the title. Now, a question might come to mind. Why go through all this trouble of employing everything the cogito is not? Lacan has multiple reasons. Firstly, Lacan is concerned not with conscious thought as studied by Descartes, but rather focuses on unconscious thought. Secondly, the cogito is based on what Lacan terms false being. It takes the ego, a shell composed of images, to be the master of its own thoughts, resting on a fixed notion of identity that rejects the idea of an unconscious. Fink ends the subchapter by summarizing, stating,
Lacan turns Descartes on his head. Ego thinking is mere conscious rationalization, the ego's attempt to legitimate blunders by fabricating explanations which agree with an ideal self-image.
This leads straight into the penultimate section, Lacan's split subject. He starts with a diagram, lifted straight from Lacan's own seminars. Looking at the top right, we can see one of Lacan's many so-called definitions of a subject.
Either I am not thinking, or I am not.
What this means is that the subject has to situate itself in some other corner of a schema, either that of thinking, where I am not being, or that of being, where I am not thinking. The subject is split between these two sides, thinking referring to the unconscious and being to the conscious. In other words, it's stuck between the full sense of self of the ego and the signifying chain. The subject in Lacan is this very split. This is why he represents it as a barred S. There is no common ground between each side. As Fink says,
the ego or false being requiring a refusal of unconscious thoughts. Unconscious thought having no concern whatsoever for the ego's fine opinion of itself.
the process that creates this bar occurs in childhood when we first learn to speak. This is the alienation of language that we originally looked at in the first episode of a series. It must also be said that, whilst the split is often rather traumatic, it isn't a sign of mental illness. In fact, the double-sided nature of the unconscious and the conscious is necessary. Psychosis for Lacan occurring when the two become confused. Ending this section, Fink looks back towards the role of language, of the big other. As he states, the other as language doesn't automatically make a subject out of the child. It can misfire, like in the case of psychosis. Rather than explainable purely in linguistic terms, the subject is thus an excess of structure. The subject is caught between two forms of otherness, that of the ego, other insofar as it's built up from ideal images disconnected from the analyzer and themselves, and that of the unconscious, as the other's discourse. We're now at the final section of the whole chapter, beyond the split subject. In Fink's words,
Now the split subject is by no means Lacan's last word on subjectivity, there being a further aspect to the subject.
these further aspects are what Fink seeks to talk about more in the following chapters. First, though, he looks to Lacan's understanding of Freud's famous statement,
Where it is, I shall be.
Demonstrating one of the many ways in which Lacan glosses this phrase, he offers this diagram. The I here isn't that of the ego. Instead, it's the I or subject of the unconscious, what analysis seeks to bring forth. Fink's main takeaway is that
This specifically Lacanian subject is not so much an interruption as the assumption thereof, that is, an acceptance of responsibility for that which interrupts, a taking it upon oneself.
Now, this concludes the chapter on the Lacanian subject from Bruce Fink's book of the same name. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at chapter 5, the subject and the other's desire, where we'll go deeper into Lacan's notion of a subject as both split and separated. Until next time, bye.